Is it possible that the stories about wreckage and supposed alien bodies recovered from the 1947 Roswell UFO crash were eventually received at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to be analyzed and reverse engineered? Is there evidence that points to this? And what happened in late March of 1966 when two F-106s from Selfridge Air Force Base were scrambled to intercept UFOs, which many people had witnessed near the town of Dexter, Michigan? And why did J. Allen Hynek decide to conclude publicly that the incident was the result of swamp gas? Was it a deliberate attempt by Hynek and Project Blue Book to quickly dismiss the case? Former Wright-Patterson Air Force Base engineer and UFO author and researcher Ray Szymanski joins me once again on the show to discuss these things and more on this episode of Passion for the Paranormal. Okay, so joining me once again on the show is former Wright-Patterson Air Force Base engineer Raymond Szymanski. Raymond is a paranormal and UFO researcher and now has 3 books to his name, all in the Alien Shades of Grey series. His first book was Alien Shades of Grey, Evidence of ET Visitations to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Beyond. And his second book, Alien Shades of Grey, Victoria's Secret Truth. And now his most recent book, Swamp Gas My Ass, which is, hey, another catchy title you've came up with there, Ray.
Thank you. It's a God-given talent.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks again for joining me on the show again. It's great to have you back on. When we talked before, I think we talked about the second book, and that covered, some people want to say experience, or some people say abductions. I think you documented kind of the abduction experiences of a lady, I believe was from Australia. I think tonight I really kind of want to get into, we didn't talk a lot about the first book and kind of what you've gleaned from your research. You've worked at Wright-Patterson for nearly 40 years. I've been to Wright-Patterson in my travels. I think when we talked before, I told you, I've got a military intelligence background, serving as an intelligence officer in the Air Force. I've actually been to Wright-Patterson a couple of times, visited the National Air and Space Intelligence Center. Actually went there for a conference. It is a very big base and an interesting place. And even more important, there is a lot of lore and a lot of mystery behind what may be going on, the kind of secretive kind of stuff that may be going on there. Maybe if you could take us back, though, because I think when we talked before, you talked a little bit about when you had just started there in the new job as an engineer right out of college. You had a guy that kind of took you under his wing. I think you referred to as Al. And I think this was maybe the first day or so you were on the job, right? He kind of hit you with this, story about, have you heard about the aliens here? Kind of take us into that and what happened there.
Sure. The building I was assigned to was Building 22, and I was put under the mentorship of a guy who will call him Al. And he said, hey, it's your first week here. I want to take you through the hangar to the Greasy Spoon. That's the coffee shop. So the building complex we were in was one physical plant, but on one side was a 2-story office complex connected to a 200-foot long hangar. And then on the other side was a matching 2-story office complex. So we were going to go from one office complex to the other because the second one held the Greasy Spoon coffee shop. But we had to walk through this 200-foot wide, very dark hangar. It's probably sits 3 or 4 stories tall, totally empty, very dark. Windows were covered by these purplish blue faded, super heavy. They would have fit perfect in a castle. That's all I can tell you. Like Indiana Jones tapestry. But they were very heavy, and they were blocking out people from peering in through the windows. And we stepped down this little tiny ramp, and we hit the floor, and he says, have you heard about our aliens? Well, I was a co-op education student from the University of Detroit in engineering, and I had never heard any of this before. And he said, well, we have these aliens. There was a crash out west, and when they recovered it, they brought the machine and the occupants to Wright-Patterson for assessment, evaluation, and possible exploitation. So I said, well, where are these aliens? He said, well, they're in the tunnels. And I'm like, we have tunnels? And he goes, yeah, we got tunnels everywhere. And I said, so the aliens are in the tunnels? He said, right. Well, Al, can we go see these aliens in the tunnels? Well, no, I'm sorry, we can't. Well, why not? Well, it's a secret. And now, Al, if it's a secret, it might have been my first week, but I knew the definition of secret. Secret
Sure.
is something that, you know, uh, three people can keep if two of them are dead. so, so I said, well, we can't see them. He said, no. And look at the time. So we went ahead and got the candy bar and pretty much walked in silence back to our office space. And I worked with him. This was first week of January 1973, so it was a 90-day rotation. What I did after that is everybody that he introduced me to that was his friend, I could tell, it was like, Doug in accounting or somebody else in this department, as he was showing me the ropes, I'd ask him once I talked to them casually, hey, Al told me this story about aliens at Wright-Pat. What do you know? And everyone to a person said, oh yeah, we all know about that. They had Project Blue Book here on base for 20 some years, and it's all over the newspapers and local radio and television. And yeah, the aliens are in the tunnels. It was always the aliens are in the tunnels. I don't know why. They love their tunnels.
Now
So that
Al says this to you with a completely straight face.
completely straight face. They
Wow.
keep them in the tunnels. But I think, looking back on it, certainly in the position that Al was in at the time, he didn't have access to that. Al was, some manufacturing engineer graduate. But do you know he eventually became a member of the senior executive service?
Wow.
So,
Yeah,
he was
that's
equal to a general. So
right.
this wasn't some guy that was just, some dumb puppy. And when I was writing the first book, which was really strange the way that happened, I found his address and I sent him a letter. And I said, hey, Al, I remember the story and it's like it happened yesterday. So I wrote that story out on maybe 2.5, 3 typed pages, and I mailed it to him and said, this is the way I remember it going down. If you don't remember it at all, I won't use it, but I'm going to use it in a book if you have any comments on it. And he writes, and I still have the letter today. He writes on it like a good SES, writes on the piece of paper, hey, as you know, I'm a member of the senior executive service. You cannot use my real name, but thank you so much for, including me in your book. And then the only notation he made in that 2.5 pages or whatever it is in the book, it's literally printed in the book. He wrote, I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of aliens at Wright-Patterson. And that I
Oh,
published that comment in the book and put it in parens. So
wow.
that's how it went down. Everything that I knew is in the book. And I honestly don't recall if I duplicated part of that in a book or not, but during my many, many talks, I actually use that as part of a PowerPoint slide, and I show his handwritten notes within that original manuscript.
Wow. That's interesting because you think if he didn't know anything about it, he may have just laughed it off or just, kind of in a joking manner, would have said something about it. But then you get that statement, I can neither confirm and deny. That kind of leaves you scratching your head, right? You're kind of like, oh, wow, can neither confirm or deny this. Did this guy have really know something in an official capacity about this, or was it just hearsay? Did he just hear things?
I would think it was just their general knowledge of what went on, and then what they had heard with all the reports and everything else, because we had the local newspaper, the Skywriter, and I'm sure that that's the base newspaper, and I'm sure that there were stories in there that were covering Blue Book's activities. And Al had been on the base during the time that Blue Book was still active and during the time that it was eventually shut down, so that was big news. I really doubt that because of, I know the positions that he was in up until the time I knew him, he wouldn't have been in a position where he would have been privy to that type of information. But you know what? You never know.
Sure. Now, I mentioned I worked in the intelligence community in the Air Force for a number of years, both on active duty and as an IMA reservist capacity. And, that's just the kind of topic. You're working in a skiff. It's the kind of topic you just don't breach, Sure, I read a lot about the UFO cases and such, but it wasn't a topic that I would entertain with other fellow, Air Force officers, that sort of thing. Although I did have I just want to share this story briefly. I was working in a skiff one time, and it was a joint command. The last several years of my career on the reserve side, I worked in a joint command. There was an Army reserve officer. He was sitting back in his office, and I came back to chat with him. And up on his computer screen, I look over at his computer, and he's got a picture. Actually, he's got Stephen Greer up on his screen, Dr. Stephen Greer. And, this is in a skiff. He's unclassified, his unclassified computer. And I look over there and I said, well, that's interesting. What you looking at there? I said, oh, well, I was looking at this video my friend sent me about this disclosure project crap. He says, it's, if this is anything real, it's got to be demons. This is an Army major telling me this. So he, and he of course, he, clicked off of the video pretty quick after that. But I just thought it was interesting because, this is just kind of the kind of topic you don't really talk about in those circles. I think I had one guy I worked with when I was out of Pacific Command that, he mentioned Roswell and he thought they had recovered alien, but I mean, it was kind of in a joking manner. So it was just kind of a, it's almost like you feel like you bring up a topic like that in those kind of circles, you're going to hear the kind of the record scratch. Like it's going to be kind of like looking at you like, okay, don't bring up that subject. But I imagine there was a lot of joking and kind of banter that went on. How much of that went on when you worked there about this kind of topic and working around other engineers?
Well, we found a way to keep the joking to a minimum, and had a number of very good, serious discussions, and myself personally with folks in the intelligence business whom I got to know over the years. And what we would do is, you've probably seen it, it's called the U.S. Air Force UFO identification chart. And there's about 16 images on this chart. There's the Klingon battleship and the USS Enterprise, and there are bombers and the F-117 stealth. And under each one, the title is weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon. And then there's actually a picture of the weather balloon, and underneath the weather balloon it says swamp gas.
I haven't seen that one, but that's great.
Well, I will send you a copy. It's called the Air Force UFO identification chart. So what we did is this, it just happened. But those of us who posted that in their cubies were implicitly telling everybody, the visitors, you can talk UFOs with me on a serious basis. So as you went from office to office, or whenever you visited somebody in a different building, if you had a meeting with somebody and that was in their cubie, it was a sign that here sits a person that you can intelligently discuss this topic with. And there was very little of this, joking. It became a, hey, listen, I'm so-and-so and I'm working in this directorate, and I've heard this, what have you heard? Or I've actually taken photographs to people who had connections in the intelligence community, and I said, I've looked at this stuff for years, this is the best photo I've ever seen, can you have your friend of a friend of a friend look at this? And a couple of weeks later, guy come back, he said, if you can trust the source, it looks authentic to him. So there was a
So these are
serious,
image interpreters that are probably looking at this then. They
of
probably got imagery analysts to look at this.
that's exactly who it was, but it turns out it started with a guy that I knew worked in intelligence circles in the building, and I just, was working with him in a different capacity. And after a while, I said, this thing's been nagging me. By the way, do you know anyone who could have a look at this and pass judgment on it? And so there was a lot of seriousness. And then back in 1997, when the Phoenix lights happened,
Oh yes,
and
great case.
and the poor guy at Luke Air Force Base, who was the public affairs guy, I think he was a lieutenant, he might have been a captain. He had to put out that story that it was flares dropping.
Right.
Well, as you know, if you're on an Air Force base and you have a CAT card and you have email, you have access to the global. So
Sure.
I look in the newspaper, I found out the guy's name, I get his address on the global, and I type him a short email and I say, that is the dumbest thing I've ever had. Please stop saying those things because you're making me and the rest of everyone else who works for the Air Force look really stupid. And I
Right.
wasn't and I wasn't the only one that sent him an email that said, hey, we know you have to BS, but please try to find something a little bit more believable than military flares accounting for 3-mile wide UFOs flying over the Phoenix airport.
Right.
So there were some serious folks there. And yeah, most of the people didn't really care. That wasn't part of their interest. So they're the ones most likely to cut a joke on it.
Sure. Maybe they play the X-Files music in the background and you bring the subject up. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I've heard you talk before about, kind of what you've gleaned from your research. Now, going back to the Roswell case, 1947, reported Roswell UFO crash. There's a lot of talk about debris that went from Roswell to Dallas and then on to, I don't know if there was another intermediary point, and then maybe on to Wright-Patterson. What have you kind of gleaned from your research about the possibility of that?
Well, Major Jesse Marcel, who was an intelligence officer for the 409th Bomb Group there in Roswell, he was the first military person to actually go and fetch the material from the Foster Ranch about 70 miles northwest of Roswell. It was closer to a town called Corona. So he and his associate, another intelligence officer, they went up with what are called carryalls, jeeps, I guess, and they filled them and brought them back. They analyzed them for a day. They looked at them. Colonel Blanchard, who was in charge of the base, he told his public affairs guy, Walter Hout, tell the world we got us a flying saucer, a crashed disc. So many years later, back in 1978, Marcel had read articles about UFOs and it was attached to an Air Force name. So he thought the oath of secrecy he had sworn on this 30 years before had lapsed. So he then had a conversation with Stanton Friedman, and he told Friedman in a video recording, hey, it was not of this planet. It was nothing I'd ever seen before. It certainly wasn't a weather balloon. We tested it. We tried to crack it, burn it, split it, cut it. It was impossible. This was not of this planet. Then Marcel was tasked to escort that material from Roswell to the 8th Army Air Corps headquarters in the Fort Worth area back in 1947. And as you know, when he got there, General Ramey had this whole thing set up. He made Marcel look like an imbecile. He substituted the material that Marcel had actually flown there with a real tattered weather balloon. Then they called the press in and told Marcel, shut up, say nothing. And then they took photographs of Marcel with this material. If anybody in the world would have known this was not a weather balloon, it would have been people like Jesse Marcel, but he was just following orders. 30 years later, he thought, now these guys are dead. I'm just going to tell the real story. And he did. When he brought that material to the 8th Army headquarters in Fort Worth, The chief of staff of that office was a general. And he, in a late affidavit before he died, a legal document said that that material went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So the guy who handled it and the guy who was basically running the staff of the office through which it passed in Texas both said it went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt.
Now, it's interesting as well that they recalled that press release. And if I remember right, I visited the Roswell UFO Museum about 20 years ago as I was passing through there, and they had that press release, a copy of that, if I remember right. Don't hold me to that. It seems like they did, though, have a copy of that press release that they recanted or pulled back. It certainly begs the question, why did they ever release the story to begin with? If this was just happened to be a weather balloon. The other thing that I wanted to maybe if you could touch base on a little bit is you had a story in there about kind of a strange individual that you came in contact with. There's been a lot of talk about the Men in Black, what they look like. I think you came in contact with kind of an unusual individual, kind of dressed in that nature. Could you recount that story?
Twice. I had two conversations with the individual, and not in the book are a number of other contacts I had with men who were dressed like Men in Black, but that never made the book for some good reasons. Anyway, I was driving down the fairway. It's the 10th hole. Yes, it's the 10th hole of what's called the Prairie Trace Golf Course at Wright-Patterson. Wright-Patterson has two 18-hole golf courses, Prairie Trace, Twin Base, and then a 9-hole course. So I'm in my cart, and I had pushed the ball, hooked it a little bit to the left. And when I was driving over there, I noticed a guy who was in the shadows, looked exactly like a Man in Black. Now, why is that important? If I was in Walmart and I saw a guy dressed like that, it wouldn't mean a thing. But the 10th fairway parallels the Foreign Technology Division campus at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And as we know, Project Blue Book and its predecessors were hosted and run by the personnel in that building in FTD. Now, it might have been a separate building off at the time, but that's the complex where NASIC, formerly FTD, formerly the owners of Project Blue Book. So the fact that the guy had merely stepped across a little road to get some shade and to look at his handheld device, which they're not allowed to have inside that building. They come in, they got to drop them into a little lockbox. So I went over, and this is, I think the first occasion was late May. Now, in late May, I got married in late May, and on the day I got married in 1977, it was 90 degrees and 90% humidity, and it just, you're drenched. So here's this guy, you know, with dark clothes, and he's wearing a friggin' hat in this heat. And so I just had to go up. Yeah, the fedora. And it's a photo of him is in the book, in my first book. So I went up to him and I just said, you know, considering where you're standing and everything, you're really dressed kind of unusual, you know, the Men in Black look. And he takes his hat off to show me why he's wearing the hat. And he takes the hat off, and he's got this strange olive complexion, but he's bald. And he's kind of indicating, well, dude, I got the hat on because I'm bald and I look better with the hat on. Well, that still doesn't explain the attire. You know, maybe you want people to talk about you because you work in that building. But here's what I theorize. And I had another conversation with him later about would it be okay if I took his picture and put it in the book? And he says, well, why would I let you do that? And I said, because we would both make a lot of money. To which he said, it's not a good idea for people like me to have our pictures in books or whatever. And Yeah, so I had 2 conversations with him, and he was trying to tell me that he had the hat on because of his complexion. But the point is, again, men in black, if they exist, they have to be somewhere during the day, right? And what more appropriate place to be and live and work is the building that is most associated with that phenomenon and with UFOs and UFO investigation than the building that he was literally across the street from. I rest my
Right.
case.
That's yeah, that's quite a story. And then I also know you did some research into there's this supposed Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson. There's been a lot of talk about it. I think there was a movie like in the late 70s or early 80s that came out called Hangar 18. And I think you did a little bit of digging, kind of, just in your own time about this. What have you been able to kind of glean from your research into this? And do you think that Hangar 18 exists?
I think Hangar 18 exists as something notional. I found maps from 1947, and I went and I looked at the buildings that were still labeled as 18. And it's interesting because the base had at one time areas A, B, C, and D. Then for the longest time it was area A, B, and C because D was bulldozed. And now they've cut the highway and joined area A and C. And honestly, I don't know what they call it today, AC, CA. But the fact is that because there were those separate areas, building numbers could be replicated between them. So in area B, for example, there were 8 buildings that were labeled 18A, 18B, 18C. In area A, there was a hangar, um, 18, but I won't say hangar. It was a small building next to a hangar. It actually had transformers and it was super loud, and it had a chemical, biological, radiological, high energy and nuclear sign on it. But the thing was only 15 by 20 and it was cinder block, and you could hear a motor. And there's building 18s and that in other areas. It's too much to get into detail here, but if you look up one of my other YouTube presentations, generally a library presentation that I've done the exploration of Hangar 18, you'll see that whole archaeology that I did on that. But my bottom line is many buildings were labeled 18. I think Hangar 18 is notional because you don't need a hangar. When the material from Roswell was picked up, most of it was 2 inches by 2 inches. The longest piece was a 2 foot by 3 foot piece. Do I need a hangar to store that? No, not in 1947. They probably brought it in a briefcase, went to the materials director and said, here guys, here's some stuff we picked up. We can't tell you anything about it. You've got all this money we're giving you, all these scientists, all this equipment. 6 months from now, you tell us everything you can. Do an elemental analysis, do burn tests, do stretch tests. Tell us, whatever you know. You don't need a hangar for that. I think it's just simply notional.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to get into the new book, the story. What prompted you to actually delve into this case and write the book about this?
Super good question. I'm a born Detroiter, raised Detroiter, went to De La Salle High in Detroit. My undergrad is the University of Detroit. My family and 1,000 cousins all live there. So it was something that was I was aware of, and the swamp gas thing has bothered the hell out of me because I am clearly the least fan of Dr. Hynek and the debunking he did, the paid debunking he did for over 2 decades for the Air Force. And growing up in Detroit, I grew up on the northeast side, so I was only about 25 miles from Selfridge Air Force Base, which was at the core of the story. And when we moved in 1966, we moved to East Detroit, so which put us even closer. Now I was only 15 miles from Selfridge. So I had this knowledge and affinity to the story, and then an opportunity arose. I was doing some research, a lot of legwork, and I was able to identify a potential individual who might know something about the story. And if truth be told, I already had a different book half written. So I said, you know, I'm going to put that half written book aside now, and I'm going to go investigate this. And when I talked to the individual for the very first time, they're 85 years old now. He wouldn't tell me the truth. He just said, you know, get in touch with me. I've got a story for you. So I bided my time and I tried to find things out about this individual because I had his name then. And I found a few more interesting facts. So I finally made an arrangement to interview him. And first interview, he tells me, I intercepted a UFO in 1966 in Michigan. And I had the Holy Grail. I had
Wow.
the swamp gas UFO guy. And, you know, at that point, it was gotta verify, gotta corroborate. So it was a long series of interviews and visits to archives and talking to historians and newspapers and that sort of thing.
Wow. Now, did he talk about, or was he able to talk about what happened at the, because every pilot gets a debriefing, right? The intel folks come out and debrief them. In this case, it must have been the Project Blue Book folks that came out to debrief them. I don't know if J. Allen Hynek was part of that. Was he able to talk about or share any of that story about what may have happened at the debrief?
I'm going to back up. The way I wrote Swamp Gas My Ass was, if you'll excuse the expression, I had to peel back the onion one interview at a time. And these are all recorded interviews. I used my Pixel 3, put it up on a little stand, hit the video button, and it worked perfectly, totally non-intrusively. And I captured over 30 hours of these interviews. What I would do is I would let him tell me a core story. I'd ask a question and let him run till he needed to catch his breath or get a drink of water. Then I would go home that night and I would listen to it and I would write down some more questions. So, you know, he mentioned, well, we were debriefed or we did this. And then I would dig deeper and deeper and deeper. So here are some surprising things that the readers will find once they get this book. I kept trying to dig down to bedrock. I wanted no stone unturned, no question unasked, because I wanted to use the answers as breadcrumbs to find corroboration. And with respect to the debriefing, he was totally surprised because, okay, here's what happens to bring everybody up to speed. It's March 1966. UFOs are being reported all over southeastern Michigan. Close encounters. In one case, they were viewed by 90 co-eds at Hillsdale College who had called the local civil defense director to come witness this because he was in charge of public safety for the area and the guy's wife worked at the university. So he was a natural to come and answer these concerns. A whole dormitory was looking out their windows for over 4 hours, watching a ship move up and down and flash lights over the local arboretum, which is right there, just a couple hundred yards away from this dormitory. And so then the day before, dozens of law enforcement officers were in Dexter, Michigan, and they were chasing around UFOs, 4 UFOs with Frank Manor and his son. And the images you're going to show later will comment on, and I'll describe how that fits in with Frank Manor and the other witnesses. While this was going on, there were so many things happening that future President Ford, who was a representative, and Weston Vivians, who were representatives for that area, were getting phone calls and mail and visits to their office. And so they contacted Blue Book and said, you know, send somebody out there. So this was just this massive thing, and it was making national news. And then, of course, J. Allen Hynek comes in, and Hynek comes in on the 25th of March and says it was swamp gas. He tells the world it was swamp gas. Now that's international news. So when I say that my pilots intercepted the swamp gas UFO, there were 4 UFOs that were consistently seen in groups of 2 and joining together as 4, then breaking up into individuals. So just by reading all the accounts, it is clear that there was a group of 4 UFOs, whether they were coming in from a mothership daily, but there were 4 UFOs that were consistently spotted and reported by first responders, law enforcement, civil defense directors, heads of universities. Those are the swamp gas UFOs that I referred to. Now, which one of those 4 my guys actually intercepted and got on radar, nobody really knows. But based on their accounts, newspaper accounts, and all the other factoids that I could put together, it's clear to me that their intercept happened in late March of 1966. So Hynek came there and did this press conference. My pilots, when they were debriefed, were unaware of the press conference. So, you know, they couldn't tell me, well, we did the chase before, we did the chase after, because those UFOs hung around for another 2 weeks in the Michigan area. And there are newspaper accounts, and they were there for weeks beforehand. So there's a much longer span than just, you know, the 25th of March when Hynek showed up to do the press conference. What you'll find in the book is an annoyingly intense, minuscule question, second by second question and answer of what happened, not only in the intercept, but what happened in the debriefing room and what happened when they got a call from the guys that were vectoring them around. It was Battle Creek was the control center, and an intelligence agent called them. So I spent a lot of time interviewing Gary and taking that data out of the transcripts about what happened during the debriefing. So the highlights are, you know, they set the recorders out there, they put them up on the screen, and his wingman was he retired as a lieutenant colonel, Bob Nicholson. Bob Nicholson was his wingman that day. And I have actually, as part of the book, Bob Nicholson's family gifted me his memoirs.
Oh, wow.
And gave me copies of his official military records, his DD-214s. So I use that as part of the basis for the book. So that day they go up, they come down, they've intercepted the UFO, and now somebody's assigned to debriefing them. They bring the boxes out that have the radar recordings, and they hook them up to devices. And Gary, Colonel Carroll, Gary Carroll, tells the debriefers, we go to this section, you're going to see the radar returns we got. We didn't get infrared, but we got radar returns. And sure enough, they find that. I don't want to spoil it, but I will tell you that Gary was extremely surprised at how naive that debriefer was, and how he didn't really, maybe because he wasn't attached to the outside world, he didn't know how much hubbub, because even Gary said, we really weren't up on this. We were flying every day in training, and nobody was feeding us stories about UFOs. we'd heard about it, or saw it in some announcement, but it really wasn't a daily topic. So the debriefer, had he been more aware of what was going on, would have said, holy, schmolies, guys, this is huge. You don't know what you just did. Instead, it was kind of standard, mundane things. The guy from the control center, Battle Creek, was a little bit more particular, and he knew more of what to look for and the questions to ask. But I won't spoil the bottom line to all of this. I can just tell you they were debriefed twice, once right after the mission, and they put their guns away and whatever they do, and then once a couple hours later when Battle Creek called, and it was clearly an intelligence officer asking much better questions. All of that is detailed in the book, ad nauseum.
I want to share the screen here and pull up an image. So one of them is actually of the meeting that J. Allen Hynek had with some of the local police there. Some of the interviewing that he did, if I can get this to come up. He's actually there with police. But what I wanted to talk about on this story, maybe I'll get that to come up here in a minute, was that I think in the newspaper article it mentioned that J. Allen Hynek kind of hit the ground researching and investigating the incident, and then supposedly he gets some sort of phone call from DC, and he comes out with an entirely different mannerisms. He comes out with an entirely different kind of expressions, and next thing he's he's talking about swamp gas and all this kind of stuff. What have you kind of found out about his research into it as you wrote the book?
Yeah, what really happened is Dr. Hynek was an astronomer, and he had friends who worked in the University of Michigan astronomy department. In fact, on the 3 nights that he spent in Michigan, he spent them at one of those professors' homes. And on his first night of arrival, that professor hosted a little social circle with Dr. Hynek in the middle, and about 12 of the employees from the astronomy department at the University of Michigan. And it was during that first evening when one of those astronomers mentioned the possibility that it could be swamp gas. And that's where Dr. Hynek got that idea. So he told his bosses, look, we've got this fabulous idea that it could be, we got this great excuse, and I'm going to explore it further. You guys go off and do some research and run it up the flagpole and see what, the Secretary of the Air Force has to say, because that's the guy that's going to weigh in on this. So they ran it all the way up to Washington, and I think it was the night prior to his press conference when he got that call, because he was using the sheriff's office as a base of operations, and the sheriff was actually helping him locate some of the witnesses, and was there when Dr. Hynek was doing the assessment of the witnesses and interviewing them. So he was using the sheriff's office as his base of operations. He got the call, and then he turned to the sheriff and said, it's swamp gas, which means he got the approval from the higher ups to use that as the explanation to the press the next day. So that's where that all came about. And interestingly enough, one of the professors that was at that little circle collection there, he was the go-to guy for the next 12 months anytime the press needed an anti-UFO comment. And the fact that the guy was never at one of these things, never saw it, never witnessed it, he was just all too happy to go, well, I think what people were seeing was the observatory that the University of Michigan owns 30 miles north of here. And total BS like this stuff. Oh, no astronomer in his right mind would ever think that UFOs exist. So the press tapped him as the okay, we can't get debunking quotes from Hynek. Let's use this astronomy professor from the University of Michigan, and I gave him his due glory in my book.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got another interesting. This is a newspaper article here of the incident.
Yeah, that's from the Ann Arbor. It's from the Ann Arbor newspaper.
Yeah, so these lights are kind of interesting. I think some could look at those and say, oh, well, those could just be, you know, meteors or something like that. The interesting thing is they're kind of side by side here. But there was some interesting things in that article, and one talked about that phone call that J. Allen Hynek got from DC.
I want to pause you here if I can, and I hope it's not being rude. That may be the only photograph that was worth debunking, and I'll tell you why. Because the police officer who took that had that on a time exposure. So the lights in the on the lower part that are city lights are going to be stable, but the lights in the sky could have been a partial moon or a planet. So that's a very poor example to try to prove the swamp gas UFO story. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm just cautioning the listener that that may have been a time, it was a time lapse, and that may have just been, again, something celestial that showed up, and unfortunately, you know, that was one of the only pieces of evidence that the Air Force wanted to put forth because it was easy to debunk.
Okay, so yeah, the other thing that the article talked about was when J. Allen Hynek got the phone call and how he kind of changed his tune about that. Now, weren't there a lot of independent witnesses here, including law enforcement, that came out and said, you know, we saw these craft? I mean, how many witnesses, based on your research, had come forward in the case?
I think quotable, there were dozens. And you can find the law enforcement reports. There are newspaper reports of law enforcement officers talking about this. There are law enforcement reports that are part of Project Blue Book. So if you can get access to the Blue Book files, which I have, some of the police reports are in there. So there are dozens that you can quote, but there are hundreds that newspaper men interviewed. Some names they gave, some they didn't. And for example, 87 co-eds at Hillsdale College, 87, same night, same event, plus all the administrators who were there that were called to the fore to witness this. The civil defense director who eventually went off to that landing site and found actual evidence of an alien craft or whoever owned it contact and leaving behind chemical evidence of its presence. So hundreds of people, dozens and dozens of law enforcement officials going on the official record. You know, it's a wonderful bit of evidence that was left behind.
I want to throw up another image here, and this was actually an artist depiction from, I guess, a few of the eyewitness accounts of what these craft were kind of looked like. So we're kind of talking about more of a saucer-shaped kind of craft, right?
You know, saucer-shaped is a very good description, but with little imagination, it looks exactly like a football. And if you go through, you know, I have a access to newspapers.com, and you know, you buy a subscription and you can find hundreds of newspaper articles on this topic. Many of them who drew that or had somebody draw it, they're all very similar. And the descriptions, it's football shaped. It was a little flatter on the bottom. In the book, well, I think it was, let's see, I started interviewing Gary about the 10th of January, 2020. And on the 14th of January, I said, I need you to draw this. And a picture of what he drew is in the book, and it's signed and dated. And it's very footballish. If you overlay his with this, They're very, very, very similar. And he saw it, some of these people saw it hovering for 4 hours. My pilot was chasing it at Mach 2. So it's a different perspective. But the fact that it had been described as football shaped is one of the things you will find consistently in all the evidence that's out there, both in the Blue Book files and newspaper files and other books that may have been written about this.
Yeah, I want to throw up another image here. So F-106 interceptor. So it sounds like they were scrambled from, like you said, Selfridge Air Force Base.
They were,
I think,
the Delta Dart.
yeah, the good old Delta Wing. And I think they used these like as drones later to like shoot at them.
I think they did.
Yeah, and I read, it's interesting you said Mach 2. I did read the unclassified top speed of these things listed at about just over Mach 2.
That's true.
So, yeah, so these things were fast movers. Your pilot said they actually scrambled and at one point was reaching a top speed of Mach 2. Is that correct? Did I understand you right there?
I might have used that expression. I think he said that when they were making the intercept, they were just at around Mach 1, and then they decided to pursue this and were going to take it all the way to the maximum speed. And at about Mach 1.3 or 1.4 is when the object, which had been, they had it in sight visually and on their radar for, say, 90 seconds at a time, multiple times. So they had a return, and they viewed the return later in the debriefing. But this object, and Gary describes it in the book, he said, it was playing with us. And then when it decided it was tired of playing, it just disappeared. And the way it disappeared, it defied physics as we know it. He said it simply sped off and made an impossible 90-degree turn to the left. What the readers are going to find out is I was facing Gary across the table for every interview, except for maybe one, and we might have been 90 degrees. But for the most part, I was across from him. Well, his left is my right. And every time he described that escape to me, his left arm would go and shoot off to the left, showing me how this thing disappeared. Well, I can be an idiot sometimes, and it always happened when he was describing this impossible physics. And I don't know why, I just got this hang up, and I said, as a follow-up question, so when this thing disappeared to your right, then what happened? And he would immediately correct me. He goes, no, it was to the left. But he was so patient, he never said, it was to the left, you imbecile. And I actually make fun of it in the book, because when I was going through the transcript, I go, dear God, did I do that again?
So the interesting thing now, he talked about this thing completely, he losing radar lock on it, and it just basically, so he's got it, he's got radar lock on this thing, and then it just basically breaks radar lock and it's gone.
Breaks lock. And he talks about how that reminds him of electronic countermeasures that he experienced in his training and that he experienced during doing other intercepts.
I have to hearken back to the Tic Tac UFO incident. That kind of reminds me. There's some elements of this that seem similar, because you got, I don't know if it was Commander David Fravor or his wingman, Chad Underwood, one of the pilots that was tracking this thing. Actually, I think it was Chad Underwood had this thing on radar lock. Actually, I think it's the FLIR. He's showing FLIR footage of them tracking this Tic Tac UFO. And he's got the cursors on it, and then this thing just simply at one point just decides, I'm done, bye-bye, it's gone, just completely breaks lock. And also reminiscent of how they talked about the 90-degree angle maneuvers and how these things are defying our known laws of physics. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit reminiscent to me of what they talked about in the Tic Tac UFO case, and how this thing kind of just suddenly disappeared. and did these kind of crazy maneuvers.
Yeah, it floored Gary because he said, here I am in the world's most sophisticated fighter interceptor, and it just left me in the dust. And at that point, they realized that they no longer had visual, they no longer had radar. The thing had just disappeared, and they decided to, make one more sweep around and then go back home. There was nothing else they could do. And
So
they weren't.
interesting thing, did the pilot talk about the secrecy behind it and how they handled this? I mean, did they just handle this like any kind of, whenever a pilot goes through a kind of intercept like this, obviously it's going to be classified, that sort of thing. But did he talk about anything above that, like how they really talked about, you can't talk about this, you can't, was he kind of sworn to never talk about this ever again? Was there any talk about that during the interview?
Well, it's fully described in the book in great detail. And again, not to be a spoiler, I can tell you he was surprised at how low key everything was handled. He had expected a lot more and, locked up for 30 days and whatever. But he said they had a job to do. I mean, they were the tip of the spear. They're in Detroit, and, Detroit is like 10-second walk across the bridge to Canada, and they feared at that time that the Russian bombers were going to come across the pole down into Canada, and that's how they were going to attack the United States. So they were basically the tip of the spear there, and their concern really wasn't UFOs, it was the Russians. So they went back to training, and he said it faded rather quickly.
Now you talked about these pilots were well-decorated pilots, Vietnam pilots, a pretty extensive background. Talk a little bit about other things that they experienced, kind of about their background, and which really kind of, to me, tells me these guys are real credible witnesses.
Well, most of his career, this is Colonel Gary K. Carroll, Carroll, and he would always tell me, it's 2 L's. I got it, Gary, 2 L's. I guess after I kept telling him he was making a right turn, he figured I need to get his last name spelled correctly. So, if you look at his DD-214, he had over 5,000 flying hours. About 4,200 of those were in the world's fastest jets. So wrap your head around that. 4,200 hours in the world's fastest jets, whatever they were, he flew them. The reader will also find out that he and Bob were reunited once. If people will remember when I believe it was the USS Pueblo was taken hostage by the North Koreans, and they held the ship and they held the crew, and there were these negotiations, and then the Air Force, in order for the US to show some force, they brought in the fighter wing that Colonel Nicholson and Bob were in, and they were actually transferred to Japan, and they were going to, protect the assets there. And during that time there was a shoot down of a Navy intelligence gathering airplane. So Bob and Colonel Nicholson were scrambled to go provide top cover for any other of US resources that were going to go into the area, and they found themselves actually chasing MiGs back into North Korea, and that whole story. And I would say the word legality comes to mind, but the whole intrusion into North Korean airspace, and that is detailed in the book, and how by happenstance they realized that they were now in SAM range in a location that would really look bad if they were shot down over the geographical area over which they were flying. But that's another story. So, these guys were crack pilots that were brought in to provide top cover for two major incidents, one which happened when they were there, and the other, eventually the North Koreans got the message and they released the Pueblo. Colonel Carroll also had jobs of huge responsibility. Again, I detail all of this. One of them was he was the head of the North American Air Defense East Coast sector. So literally the entire Air Force defense posture on the East Coast at one time was his responsibility. He was also head of Air Forces Iceland, and that was the first line of defense should the Soviet bombers decide to come over the pole and attack the United States. So, and his list goes on, and his medals and his citations and everything he's done. It's absolutely incredible. But for the reader, I got permission from Bob and Colonel Nicholson's family to include their DD-214s in the book. So the reader can look and see all the medals, they can see the training they had, they can see what planes they flew, and most importantly, they can look at the DD-214s and they can verify that they were individuals who had the skills to intercept a UFO in March of 1966 in Michigan, that they were both assigned to Selfridge Air Force Base during that time as fighter interceptor pilots. So the proof of what they did is irrefutable. And that I thought was just super important. Took me a little bit of finagling to get them to agree to do that. But once I told them that, that's the irrefutable evidence that we need to publish, they willingly agreed to put that in there.
Yeah. And Ray, are you with me?
I am now.
All right. Seems like we had a little bit of a glitch there. A little glitch in the matrix.
Just coincidental, right? There's no intelligence agencies messing with us.
Yeah,
too late, guys. The book is published.
Yeah, we just happened to be talking about Project Blue Book and the smoke and mirrors, and how they really debunked all those cases. The interesting thing I find about Project Blue Book is I've been told, and I don't know how much you've kind of delved into the Project Blue Book cases. I think 5% of them came out unexplained. As I understand it, those were not even the most juicy cases the Air Force looked at. Project Blue Book looked at a handful of cases. There's other cases that got more high-level attention, as I understand it, that were never investigated by Project Blue Book, that were investigated in other circles. And I'm just wondering, what say you about that, if you had done any research or heard anything about that?
Well, first of all, Project Blue Book claims that they solved cases that they never solved. So let's say the number is around 12,000 cases that they took a look at. Probably out of those 12,000 cases, 6,000 of them, 50%, were probably real sightings. And I'll give you an example how Project Blue Book disposed of a case and then claimed victory, just so that you can get, and the listeners can get an idea of how big a pile of BS this 5% is, as a gauge for what's unsolved. Rex Heflin in August of 1965 was a traffic engineer out in Santa Clara, California, and he took 4 photographs of UFOs that three of them were of the UFO. The 4th one was of a smoke ring that the UFO left behind. Those photographs have been subjected to the most intensive examination ever, and they've passed with flying colors. No one has ever been able to debunk them. So the way Project Blue Book scientifically and objectively disposed of the case is they had somebody throw a vaporizing tray into the air as they stood in a field at Wright-Patterson, and they used a similar but not identical camera to the one Heflin used, and they took photographs changing the focal length and the shutter speed and the distance until they got a couple of photographs that resembled the photographs that Rex Heflin took. And in their official files, they said, since we were able to replicate the photos, and they're somewhat similar but unconvincing, they said, case closed, it's a hoax. So they closed the case. Well, let's look at the facts, if you'll indulge me. First of all, was that goofy throwing the tray thing? Second thing is, the camera they used was very much unlike what Rex had. For them to produce a photo that looked like what he took, they had to change the focal length. Their camera was a Polaroid 110. Rex Heflin's was a 101. Rex Heflin did not have a focusing capability. He also couldn't change the ASA. So the elephant in the room, the Air Force needed more than 2 guys to throw pans in the air while the photographer took pictures. Rex Heflin was in his truck when he took the photographs, and you can see parts of the windshield holder in his photos. So the Air Force never answered nor brought up the elephant. How did Rex Heflin throw a pan into the air, get back into his truck, pick up the camera, focus it through the windshield of his truck, and take 3 perfectly clear photos 3 times? Rex Heflin was alone that day. Air Force never addressed that issue. So can we believe Project Blue Book when they say only 5% were unanswered? Hell no. If that is one case, and there's hundreds of cases where they did that, okay? The Michigan case, solved, it's swamp gas. It goes on and on and on. So at least, my estimate, 50% of the cases they couldn't solve. Only the ones that they couldn't come up with a insane line of BS the government was going to grab onto did they say it was unidentified.
Right.
So their claims are like their investigation, total BS.
Yeah, and you know, we both come from an Air Force background. I kind of wanted real quick because we're going to wrap up. We're getting short on time. What's kind of your thoughts? So the Navy's leading this whole UAP task force. They're the ones coming out and you know, shared the videos. What's your thoughts on where is the Air Force in all this? You haven't heard anything from the Air Force.
The Navy did it because it's going to be the Air Force's problem. And the Air Force said, had you shut your mouth, we wouldn't have to deal with this for another 75 years, right? Whose job is it to protect our airspace? The Air Force. It's not the Navy. So the Navy, once again, you know, they screwed the Air Force. But what's going to happen here is it's now going to become a budgetary issue because it's a problem that's out in the open. And it's a problem we can't solve. We've had 75 years to do it and we haven't. So now where's the money going to come from to do more research, build better defenses, you know, put different airplanes up there? Notice the Air Force hasn't said anything because it's now their problem again.
Yeah, and everybody's going to kind of harken back to Project Blue Book and, you know, what a fiasco that was. Yeah, it's just interesting that the Air Force has made no public statements or made any sort of statements lately about these videos. It's all been the Navy leading the charge, which has always been quite surprising to me, but maybe it shouldn't be surprising to me. Maybe it shouldn't be. The Air Force has always, since Blue Book, oh wait, they came out with their 97 report about Roswell. They finally closed the book on Roswell and they came out with that story at the Pentagon. That's the last time you really hear the Air Force say much about the subject. And that's it. You know, you really haven't heard the...
They did 2 reports. And in one of them, they said it was anthropomorphic dummies that people saw during the Roswell era. Well, they'd have to be time traveling anthropomorphic test dummies, because Roswell happened in 47 and it was 1953 when these anthropomorphic dummies were introduced into the Air Force inventory.
Yeah, again, you'd think they could have came up with a little better cover story than that. But hey, you know, I'm not in charge of these cases, so it's unbelievable though. Yeah, and you know, going back to just real quick on that Phoenix Lights case, you had, and I'm sure you've probably heard of this. Fife Symington finally came out. I think it was I want to say, you know, and it was well after he was done with politics. He came out on Larry King Live and said, "What I saw was not of this world." And of course, Fife Symington was an Air Force fighter pilot for several years. Said those were not flares. You know, anybody who's seen flares know what flares look like. They drop slowly out of the sky. They don't stay in formation. And you know, he made the point right there on Larry King Live that there's no way these could have been flares. He's got a trained eye. You know, he's a former Air Force fighter pilot and freely admitted that what he saw that night was not anything of this world. So just kind of an interesting tidbit information on the Phoenix Lights, because we talked about that a little bit earlier. Ray, again, we're short on time. I want to talk about the book and where people can find it. So I'm going to share the screen here again. We'll bring up a copy of it. Where can they find the new book?
Currently, they can find the book on Amazon. I publish independently because as a former Air Force long-term scientist, if you publish books, you have to go through the Air Force Literary Office in New York. And if you have a publication contract, it usually takes them about a year to do the review. But since I did not have a publisher's contract and was self-published, they looked at it, asked me a few questions, did an interview, and they approved it. So my approval cycle was a week. All right, so that's why it's on Amazon. It's self-published, and there's a little itty-bitty bookstore in a town called Fenton, Michigan. I have a friend that owns that little itty-bitty bookstore. It's called the Open Book in Fenton, Michigan, and every once in a while I will ship them autograph copies of all 3 of my books. So if you're ever up there, say hi to Karen and buy the books. They're autographed.
Awesome.
And
well, hey, Ray, thanks. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
One more comment. When I upgrade the book to make it more contemporary, instead of Swamp Gas My Ass, I might call it Military Flair My Derriere.
Love it. Good stuff. Well, hey, Ray, it's been a pleasure talking with you again. Thank you so much for spending the time with me, and best of luck and all your any more books. Well, before I get you up, any more books on the horizon here shortly?
I'm retired. I'm now retired from the government, and I think I'm retired from writing books. And I really, you know, I'm not going to do many of these shows. I'm not going to do many conferences. There's a lot of other things that I really want to do. I got a couple metal detectors. I want to look for Spanish treasure floating up on shores of Florida.
Well, good for you. Good for you. So, hey, I'm glad I got you on the show when I did. You may not be making many more of these appearances. So, once again, thank you so much for joining me and for all the work that you do.
A pleasure, Curry. Anytime, you know, I'll come back. I always have a great conversation. And thank you for letting me rant on Project Blue Book.
Absolutely. Have a great night, Ray.
Hey, you too.